February 14, 1943. Kasserine Pass, Tunisia. General Rommel stood on the ridge overlooking the Kasserine Pass and watched his tanks roll through the gap in the mountains that the American army had abandoned, and he felt something that he had not felt since the early days of the African campaign when everything had gone according to plan. He felt contempt. The Americans had fled. Not retreated in good order, leaving rear guards and destroying equipment and making the German advance pay for every mile. Fled. They had left their weapons and their vehicles and their food and their equipment scattered across the Tunisian desert, and they had run faster than his tanks could follow them. His intelligence officers were walking through abandoned American positions, finding unit records and operational orders and personal weapons and supply dumps that had not been destroyed, the residue of a force that had dissolved rather than fought. Rommel had been fighting Americans for 4 months. He had not been impressed. They were rich in equipment and poor in experience, well supplied and badly commanded, technically capable on paper and tactically incompetent in practice. His assessment was forming into a professional soldier's judgment about the army he was facing, and the judgment was that the American army was not ready to fight a first-class enemy. He was right. He was also making the mistake that he had made before in the desert, the mistake of assuming that what was true today would remain true tomorrow. The American army that fled through Kasserine Pass in February 1943 would not be the same army 3 months later. What happened between February and May 1943 in the Tunisian desert was one of the most rapid institutional transformations in the history of modern warfare, a process by which an army that had been humiliated learned from its humiliation with a speed and a thoroughness that Rommel would not have the opportunity to witness, because by the time the transformation was complete, Rommel himself would be gone from Africa. To understand what Kasserine meant, you have to understand what the American army was in February 1943 and how it had arrived in North Africa. The United States Army that existed on December 7, 1941 was a peacetime force of approximately 1.5 million men, most of them recently drafted, trained to a standard that the military's own assessments acknowledged was insufficient for the kind of warfare that the Second World War was producing. The training programs were inadequate in duration and in realism. The equipment was insufficient in quantity and in some categories in quality. The leadership, from the battalion level to the corps level, was untested in combat and uncertain in its application of the doctrine that the army had been developing. The decision to land in North Africa in November 1942 rather than in France was controversial, and the controversy was genuine. The British argument, which Churchill pressed with particular force, was that the American army was not ready for the kind of combat that a cross-channel invasion in 1942 would produce, that the German defences in France were too strong for an Allied force that lacked combat experience, and that North Africa offered the opportunity to develop that experience while achieving strategic objectives that justified the campaign independently. The Americans who landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch in November 1942 were learning their trade in the way that armies have always learned it in the absence of adequate peacetime training, by doing it under fire and paying for their mistakes in blood. The II Corps, which had moved east from Algeria to face the German and Italian forces in Tunisia, was commanded by Major General Fredendall, an officer whose career had been built on the performance metrics of peacetime army life and whose actual capability for combat command was about to be tested for the first time. Fredendall failed the test in ways that military historians have been cataloguing ever since. He established his headquarters in a canyon 60 miles behind the front, in a position so far from the action that his ability to understand and respond to the tactical situation was fundamentally compromised. He issued orders that reflected misunderstandings of the terrain and the dispositions of his own forces. He established his corps in a disposition that a more experienced commander would have recognized as vulnerable to exactly the kind of armored envelopment that Rommel was planning. The German attack that hit the American positions at Kasserine on February 14th was not sophisticated by the standards of what the Afrika Korps had demonstrated in previous years. It was a concentrated armored thrust at a point in the American line that German reconnaissance had identified as weakly held, aimed at a pass through the dorsal mountains that would allow a breakout into the rear areas of the Allied position in Tunisia. The American units that faced the initial German assault were broken by it quickly, the kind of rapid dissolution that occurs when units that lack tactical cohesion and command confidence encounter an attack delivered with the speed and violence that German armored operations produced. The positions that doctrine specified should be held were abandoned. The reserve that should have been positioned to counterattack was not positioned where it could be effective. The command and control that should have directed a coordinated defensive response failed at multiple levels simultaneously. By February 20th, Rommel's forces had advanced 50 miles through the American rear areas, captured Kasserine Pass and the town of Kasserine, and reached a position from which a continued advance threatened to roll up the entire Allied position in Tunisia. The casualties were painful. Approximately 6,500 American soldiers were killed, wounded, or captured in the Kasserine battle, with hundreds of vehicles and pieces of equipment lost. The 1st Armored Division, which bore the brunt of the fighting, was effectively destroyed as a fighting formation. But the disaster produced something that disasters sometimes produce when the institution that experiences them has the capacity for honest self-assessment and rapid adaptation. It produced change. The changes that followed Kasserine were the most significant and most rapid institutional changes in the history of the American Army since the Civil War. General Eisenhower relieved Fredendall. The decision was not easy and it was not popular with some senior officers, but it was correct, and Eisenhower made it with the understanding that the alternative to changing the leadership was continuing to lose with the same leadership. Major General George Patton was given command of 2 Corps. Patton arrived at 2 Corps headquarters and immediately made clear that everything was going to change. His assessment of what had gone wrong at Kasserine was delivered in the blunt language that was his characteristic mode of communication. The men were not the problem. The leadership was the problem. The training was the problem. The attitude was the problem. All of these things were going to be fixed, immediately and completely, because there was not time for gradual improvement. The physical training that Patton imposed on 2 Corps in the weeks after Kasserine was brutal by any standard, and was specifically designed to produce the physical hardening that the North African climate required and that the previous training had not provided. The discipline standards that he enforced were absolute and were applied immediately to every soldier regardless of rank. Uniforms had to be correct. Weapons had to be clean. Saluting had to be precise. The small disciplines that reflect the larger discipline of a fighting force had to be present and visible at all times. More fundamentally, the tactical training that Patton directed was designed to produce the coordinated combined arms performance that Kasserine had demonstrated the Corps lacked. Artillery and infantry and armor had to work together, had to train together, had to develop the mutual understanding of each other's capabilities and limitations that made combined arms effective. The command relationships between the components had to be clear and practiced. Patton gave 2 Corps 3 weeks. Not 3 months. 3 weeks. The offensive that 2 Corps launched in mid-March 1943, directed against the German positions in central Tunisia, demonstrated what 3 weeks of Patton's preparation had produced. The unit that had fled through Kasserine was attacking with a coordination and an aggression that surprised German commanders who had formed their assessment of American capabilities based on what they had seen in February. The broader Allied offensive that began in April 1943, coordinated between Montgomery's 8th Army pressing from the east and the American and British forces pressing from the west, steadily compressed the Axis position in Tunisia into a smaller and smaller perimeter. The German and Italian forces that were defending Tunisia were running out of supply and running out of space simultaneously, because the Allied air and naval superiority that had been established during the winter made resupply of the Tunisian bridgehead increasingly difficult and then effectively impossible. Rommel had left Africa in March 1943, officially for medical reasons, actually for reasons that reflected the German High Command's understanding that the Tunisian campaign was lost and that Germany's most celebrated general should not be associated with the inevitable surrender. His replacement, General Jürgen von Arnim, received the Tunisian bridgehead and the mission of defending it for as long as possible. He defended it until May 13, 1943, when approximately 275,000 German and Italian soldiers surrendered in the largest Axis surrender of the war. The men who surrendered included the veterans of the Afrika Korps, the soldiers who had humiliated the Americans at Kasserine Pass 3 months earlier. The American soldiers who had fled through Kasserine in February were among the forces that accepted the surrender in May. The transformation in 3 months was the transformation that Rommel had not allowed himself to believe was possible when he watched the American army dissolve in front of his tanks. He had been right that the American army he faced in February was not ready to fight a first-class enemy. He had been wrong that the American army would remain unready. The capacity for institutional learning and rapid adaptation that the American military demonstrated between February and May 1943 was not something that Rommel's professional assessment had adequately accounted for, because it was not something that the professional military culture he had grown up in had demonstrated in quite the same way. The German army had been trained to be excellent from the beginning. The American army had been trained to learn quickly. Both approaches had their strengths. The German approach produced units that were excellent in the first engagement. The American approach produced units that were better in the third engagement than they had been in the first and better in the 10th than they had been in the third, because the institutional mechanisms for extracting lessons from experience and applying them rapidly were more developed and more systematically used than anything in the German military tradition. The soldiers who fought in Tunisia in the spring of 1943 were the first generation of the American Army that had combat experience against German forces. Every subsequent generation of American soldiers in the European theater benefited from the lessons those men had learned and survived to transmit. The army that landed at Sicily in July 1943 was better than the army that had landed in North Africa in November 1942. The army that landed at Normandy in June 1944 was better than the army that had fought in Sicily. The army that crossed the Rhine in March 1945 was the product of a 3-year learning process that began at Kasserine Pass. General Omar Bradley, who served in Tunisia and commanded American forces from the landing in North Africa through the end of the war in Europe, wrote about what Kasserine had meant for the American Army in terms that captured the specific quality of what the experience had produced. Kasserine was the best thing that happened to the American Army in the war, Bradley wrote. Not because defeat is good. Because learning from defeat is good. And we learned. We learned faster and more completely than any army in history had learned from a comparable experience. We learned because we had to and because we were capable of it. By the end of the Tunisian campaign, the American army was a different army from the one that had run through Kasserine Pass. By the time we reached Germany, it was the best army in the world. He was right. The army that received Germany's surrender in May 1945 was the best army in the world, and it was the best army in the world in part because of what happened at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, because of what the American military learned from that experience and how rapidly it applied those lessons. The men who ran through Kasserine Pass were not cowards. They were soldiers who had not been adequately prepared and who had been inadequately led in circumstances that would have tested much better prepared units. When they were given adequate preparation and adequate leadership, they demonstrated what American soldiers are capable of when those conditions are met. They demonstrated it in Tunisia in the spring of 1943. They demonstrated it in Sicily and Italy and Normandy and the Hürtgen Forest and the Bulge and across the Rhine and all the way to Germany's unconditional surrender. It started at Kasserine. Not because defeat is where great armies begin. Because learning is where great armies begin, and Kasserine was where the American army in Europe learned what it needed to learn to become the force that ended the war. Rommel had watched the American army run and concluded that it would keep running. He was right about February 1943. He was completely wrong about everything that followed. That is the story of Kasserine Pass. That is what it cost and what it produced and what the men who ran through it in February and fought back through it in May had learned in between. They learned how to win. And then they won.